Have you ever unlocked a huge achievement on your Steam Deck only to realize later that you completely missed it? Well, Valve just fixed that. But that's not the only change in the latest Steam Deck and Steam Client update. Steam can now collect real-world FPS data from SteamOS devices, reviews can now show the PC specs the reviewer used, and Steam Input just received some surprisingly powerful upgrades. Now, technically, many of these features actually rolled out in smaller updates throughout February in the beta branch, and I've already talked about a few of them before, but now they've officially landed in the main Steam client release alongside bug fixes and quality of life improvements. So let's break down what actually changed, what was quietly added later, and what really matters for Steam Deck users. Let's start with the most interesting change in this update, and it's something that happens mostly behind the scenes. Valve has added a feature that collects anonymized frame rate data. This has been available on the beta branch for about a month now, and I think it's huge. If you enable it, Steam will gather real gameplay FPS data while you play. Valve says that the data is not connected to your Steam account, it's completely anonymized, and it's identified only by the type of hardware you're using. Right now, the focus is mainly on SteamOS devices, which means Steam Deck users are a big part of this dataset. Essentially, Valve is crowdsourcing real-world performance data from thousands of players, and over time, this will lead to improved deck verified ratings, better game compatibility data, and maybe even a section about performance on the Steam store page itself. This will generally improve the deck verified program and possibly the Steam machine verified program, which is a much needed change. Another feature that has now officially landed in the client is the ability to attach your hardware specs to Steam reviews. I actually covered this earlier when it first appeared in testing because it's a really important improvement for performance transparency. When writing or updating a review, you can now include the hardware you're playing on. So when someone says this game runs great, you will know exactly what system they tested it on. That could be a high-end desktop, a gaming laptop, or a Steam Deck or another handheld. For Steam Deck users browsing the store, this gives reviews much more useful context, especially when you're trying to figure out how a game actually runs on the handheld hardware. Now, looping back to the verification system, Valve also improved how feedback works for the deck verified system. If you submit feedback saying you disagree with the verified rating, Steam will now ask you why, and providing a reason is optional, but it gives Valve much more actionable data. For example, you might disagree because performance drops after a longer player session, or the text is too small, or the controller support isn't great. Over time, this feedback should help improve the accuracy of the deck verified rating. Now let's talk about something players will actually notice immediately. Valve has added custom notification settings for achievements. You can now enable a toast notification or a sound effect when an achievement unlocks. Before this update, the achievement pops up on Steam Deck were honestly pretty easy to miss. They pop up in the lower right corner. Sometimes they appeared so subtly that you'd barely notice them. Now you can enable sound notifications so every unlock actually feels rewarding, similar to consoles or similar to how it works on desktop. This is a small change but a nice quality of life improvement, and I welcome it fully. There are also a few improvements to the Steam library and interface. First, the way Steam handles installed demos has now been fixed. Previously, if a demo was no longer playable, it might still show a play button, and when you try to play it, you will get an error. Now those demos will show uninstall instead, making it easier to clean. A lot of these demos are time restricted, so you can only play them for a week. And now this makes sense. It's especially good after events like the Steam Next Fest. Valve also improves how recent games are organized, so new demos and free-to-play games now appear at the top of the recent game list, making them easier to find. And visually, the recent games carousel now shows the highest resolution artwork available, which makes the interface look a lot sharper. A few smaller usability changes were included as well. The lock screen settings have been simplified by merging two options into one: on system wake and power up and before login screen. After this change, enabling the lock screen to display on system wake and power up will show the lock screen during login. And in desktop mode, Valve added a helpful explanation for newer users. If you enable the tools filter in your library for the first time, it will show a dialog explaining what tools actually are. So things like Proton layers, dedicated servers, or modding utilities, you will now be able to see that. These tools also now show icons and tooltips, making the library easier to understand. Now let's talk about Steam Input, because this update includes several improvements for controller customization. One of the biggest changes affects button cord activators. So instead of a limited drop-down list of buttons, Valve replaced it with a multi-button selector. This means that newer controllers, especially one with extra back buttons or grip buttons, now have full support in Steam input. Valve also added missing options to the mode shift menu, including left stick touch or right stick touch. And for gyro users, Valve fixed a bug where certain settings wouldn't register properly unless you really move the controller significantly. And with this fixed, it's now easier to dial in precise joystick dead zones. You can also apply gyro remapping and acceleration settings per axis or circular, giving more control over camera movement. And if you use third-party controllers, Valve improved input latency while Rumble is active, keeping controllers responsive during heavy gameplay. And finally, this update fixes some annoying bugs, especially for players with very large Steam libraries. So some users were seeing Proton games labeled not valid on current platform, even though they work fine on SteamOS. This issue should now be fixed, and Valve also resolved a related problem where some games couldn't be installed at all if your library was extremely large. Other fixes include download queue errors when moving games between sections, a UI focus bug that could ignore controller inputs, gaming mode footer flickering or disappearing, keyboard themes not applying in offline mode. And these fixes may not be flashy, but they definitely improve overall system stability. Overall, this update is really a collection of small improvements that rolled out throughout February, now bundled in the main client release. Some of the biggest features like framerate data collection and hardware specs in reviews were things we've already looked at earlier, but together with the Steam input upgrades, notification improvements, and bug fixes, this update improves a lot of the small details of the Steam Deck experience. And sometimes those smaller changes end up making the biggest differences in daily use. And as always, before updating, I would advise you to wait a couple of days if you're using Decky plugins. Usually Steam Deck updates or SteamOS updates will break those plugins, so if you don't want to see that, you should wait a couple of days. Now I'm curious about something. Are you the kind of Steam Deck user that will enable the feature like framerate data sharing to help improve compatibility, or do you prefer to keep your system completely private? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like, or let me know how and what I can improve for the next one. And if you want to push your Steam Deck even further, check out the video on the screen where I break down some of the best power accessories and charging solutions for the Steam Deck. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.